Mary's hands were trembling as she stood by the window, staring out into the early evening. She watched as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting an orange glow across the landscape. The serenity of the view contrasted sharply with the turmoil raging within her. Just a few feet behind her, her husband Jerry was sprawled on the living room couch, remote in hand, barely paying any attention to her or the two children who were playing in the adjacent room. "Dinner's almost ready," Mary called over her shoulder, her voice strained. She wanted to keep her tone light, as though everything was normal, as though the last conversation she had overheard between Jerry and his mother, Janet, hadn't shredded her heart. Jerry didn't respond. Instead, he gave a slight grunt, acknowledging her words, but his eyes stayed glued to the television screen. Mary swallowed the tight knot in her throat, trying to keep her composure. Janet's arrival had been expected that day, and Mary could feel the pressure building within her with every passing second. It was always the same with Janet. She'd come in, criticize every little thing about Mary, her cooking, her appearance, her care for the children, and worst of all, the way she took care of Jerry. Mary never seemed to get anything right in Janet's eyes, and to make things worse, Jerry never intervened. He never stood up for her. He simply stayed silent, an accomplice in his mother's games. The doorbell rang and Mary's stomach twisted into a knot. She knew who it was without even looking. Janet was always punctual, arriving exactly when she said she would. Mary took a deep breath, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked to the door, forcing a smile. She opened it to find Janet standing there, a haughty look on her face, her sharp eyes immediately scanning the hallway behind Mary, as if looking for something out of place. "Mary," Janet said, her voice dripping with disdain, "you look tired." Mary's smile faltered for a moment before she managed to regain it. "Good evening, Janet. Please, come in." Janet brushed past her, her gaze already moving around the house, searching for anything she could comment on. Mary shut the door and turned around to see Janet approaching Jerry. He sat up, a grin on his face, and greeted his mother with far more enthusiasm than he ever showed Mary. "Hey, Ma." "How was your trip?" Jerry asked, patting the spot next to him on the couch. Janet sat down, her eyes flicking towards Mary, who was still standing in the doorway, feeling like an intruder in her own home. "It was fine," Janet said. "But Jerry, you need to take better care of yourself. You look thin. Are you eating enough?" Mary clenched her jaw, forcing herself to look away. It was a ritual by now. Janet would always make these comments, implying Mary wasn't taking care of her husband properly. She walked back into the kitchen, her heart pounding as she stirred the pot of soup on the stove, trying to keep her focus. The evening dragged on, with Janet making snide comments about everything from the cleanliness of the house to the meal Mary had prepared. Mary tried to smile through it all, but each word cut her deeper, especially when Jerry laughed along, not once coming to her defense. The final straw came when Janet made a comment about their children, about how they would turn out to be unruly because of Mary's lax parenting. Mary's hands tightened around the edge of the table. She glanced at Jerry, hoping, praying he would say something, anything to stand up for her. But he didn't. He just stared at his plate, pretending he hadn't heard. That night, as Mary lay in bed next to Jerry, she could feel the anger simmering beneath her skin. She had spent years putting up with Janet's cruelty, thinking that if she were patient enough, things would change. But they hadn't. And the realization that Jerry would never take her side, that he would always choose his mother over her, was like a slap to the face. She blinked back tears, staring at the ceiling, her heart heavy with the weight of her unhappiness. The following morning, Mary woke up early, her mind made up. She couldn't keep living like this. Not for herself, and not for her children. She had to do something. Had to take back some control over her life. She got out of bed quietly, careful not to wake Jerry, and went to the kitchen. She started making breakfast, her movements deliberate and focused. Today would be different. When Janet came down the stairs, her eyes immediately landed on Mary, who was standing at the stove. Janet pursed her lips, already preparing to make some comment, but Mary turned to face her, her eyes meeting Janet's with a calmness she hadn't felt in years. "Janet," Mary said, her voice steady, We need to talk. Janet raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. About what? Mary took a deep breath. About the way you've been treating me. I can't keep doing this. I love Jerry and I want to make this family work. But I won't allow you to disrespect me in my own home any longer. Janet's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment she was speechless. Then she laughed, a cold, mocking sound. You think you can tell me what to do? In my son's house? Mary straightened her back, her hands steady as she set the spatula down. This is my home too, Janet, and if you can't respect me, then you're not welcome here. Janet looked at her, her face turning red with anger. She opened her mouth to say something, but Jerry walked into the kitchen at that moment, looking between the two women with confusion. What's going on? He asked, his voice groggy from sleep. Mary looked at him, her heart pounding. Jerry, I need you to understand something. I love you, but I can't keep letting your mother treat me like this. If you can't stand up for me, then I will stand up for myself. Jerry stared at her, his eyes wide. He looked at his mother, who was glaring at Mary with fury in her eyes. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Mary felt a pang of sadness as she realized in that moment that Jerry would never change. He would never stand up for her. She turned back to the stove, her hands trembling slightly as she continued making breakfast. Janet stormed out of the kitchen, and Jerry just stood there looking lost. Mary didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. She had said what she needed to say, and now it was up to Jerry to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. The rest of the day passed in a tense silence. Janet had locked herself in the guest room, and Jerry spent most of his time avoiding Mary, his eyes filled with confusion and anger whenever they crossed paths. But Mary felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time in years, she had stood up for herself, and even though the outcome was uncertain, she knew she had done the right thing. That night, as Mary sat on the edge of her bed, she heard a soft knock on the door. She looked up to see her daughter standing there, her eyes wide with worry. Mary smiled gently, patting the spot next to her on the bed. Her daughter climbed up, resting her head on Mary's shoulder. "Mommy, are you okay?" she asked, her voice small. Mary wrapped her arm around her daughter, holding her close. "I'm okay, sweetheart," she whispered. "Sometimes we have to do hard things to make things better, but I promise you everything will be okay." Her daughter nodded, closing her eyes as she snuggled closer. Mary kissed the top of her head, her heart swelling with determination. She had done this for her children, for herself. No matter what happened next, she knew she would find a way to make it through, because she was stronger than she had ever realized. The following morning, Janet packed her things and left without a word. Jerry watched her go, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything to Mary, and she didn't push him. She knew he needed time to process everything, to decide where his loyalties lay. And Mary had made her peace with whatever decision he would make. Days passed, and slowly things began to change. Jerry was distant at first, but Mary remained patient. She focused on her children, on making their home a place filled with love and respect. She refused to let the shadows of the past control her anymore. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Jerry finally spoke. His voice was hesitant, unsure. "Mary, I've been thinking about what you said, about my mom and everything. I want to do better. For you. For us." Mary looked at him, her eyes searching his face. She could see the sincerity there, the struggle. She nodded, her heart swelling with hope. "Thank you, Jerry," she said softly. "That's all I've ever wanted. For us to be a team." Jerry reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I love you, Mary. I know I've let you down and I'm sorry. I want to make it right." Tears filled Mary's eyes, and she smiled, squeezing his hand. "I love you too, Jerry, and I believe we can make it work." For the first time in what felt like forever, Mary felt a sense of hope for the future. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would be challenges ahead, but she also knew that she had the strength to face them, that she wasn't alone, and that was enough. As the days turned into weeks, Jerry began to change. He started standing up for Mary, defending her when Janet called with her usual criticisms. He made an effort to be more present, more supportive. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension, but Mary could see that he was trying, and that made all the difference. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset, Jerry turned to Mary, his eyes filled with emotion. "I know I've made a lot of mistakes," he said quietly, "but I want you to know that I'm committed to being better, to being the husband you deserve." Mary smiled, her heart swelling with love. She reached out, taking his hand in hers. "I know, Jerry, and I'm proud of you, of us, for fighting for our family." Jerry nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He leaned over, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "I love you, Mary, and I promise I'll never let anyone make you feel less than you are ever again." Mary closed her eyes, leaning into his embrace. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't be without its bumps, but she also knew that together they could face anything. Because they were a team, and nothing could break them apart. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over their home, Mary knew that this was just the beginning. A new chapter in their lives, one filled with hope, love, and the promise of a better tomorrow. And she couldn't wait to see where their journey would take them.